Hello, wonderful people. Let's talk about some mistakes that you need to avoid when writing your code with HTML. Okay, so a consistent, a clean, and a tidy HTML code will make it easier for other developers to read and understand your code. So in this particular video, I'm going to talk to you about certain behaviors that you need to adopt, certain mistakes that you need to avoid. Okay, so it's going to be a kind of guideline or some tips that you can use in order to create good HTML codes. Okay, so the first one is, okay, the first rule that you need to respect, that is going to be to always declare your document type. So always declare the document type as the first line in your document. So you need to add this doc type here. Okay, so it is going to be used to determine the version of HTML that you are using. Okay, and the correct syntax is to write it like this. You open the bracket, exclamation, doc type, space, HTML, and then you close the bracket. So that's the first tip. The following tip is going to be that you always need to use lowercase element names. Okay, so HTML can allow you mixing uppercase and lowercase letters in an element name, but it is always recommended to use lowercase element names because mixing up uppercase and lowercase names can look very bad. It looks bad. For example, if I write this element body in using the uppercase here and then write the lowercase like this, you can see that it's not uniform. It's not bad. It's not looking good at all. And conventionally, all around the world, most developers normally use lowercase names as well. So lowercase looks cleaner, lowercase is easier to write as well. Okay, so if you want to write your element, for example, if you use the article element, you write it using the lowercase like this, and then inside you can write your text, something like that. But if you use the uppercase here, even though HTML allows you to do that, but it's not it's not clean. It's not good. Okay. So always use lowercase. That's another rule that you have to keep in mind. Okay. It is recommended to use lowercase elements name. Another rule that you need to keep in mind, that you need to really respect, is that you have to make sure that you close all your HTML elements. Okay, so in HTML, you do not have to close all your elements. For example, if you have a paragraph element, like paragraph like this, and then you can write some text. Let me just copy this text here. Okay, you do not necessarily need to close this particular paragraph. You will not get an error. However, it is strongly recommended to close all your HTML elements, okay, all the elements that need closing, okay, because we know we have exceptions. There are empty HTML elements that do not need closing, for example, the break line and all of that. But if you have a standard HTML element, you always need to close it like this by putting, you know, the closing tag. Okay, because sometimes it can bring confusion and it can, become very difficult for you to maintain your code. So always close your HTML elements. Another thing that we can talk about is going to be that it is recommended to use lowercase attribute names. So HTML allows, as usual, mixing uppercase and lowercase letters in your attribute names, but it is recommended that you use lowercase attribute names. The first reason is The same thing, mixing uppercase and lowercase, can look bad. For example, if you have like this, maybe class and and then later on you have title in lowercase like this. You see, it does not look good at all. So lowercase always looks cleaner and easy to actually read and maintain. And lowercase is also easier to write. So this is better than having uppercase attribute names. All right. So that's it for lowercase. So always write your attribute names using lowercase. The next rule that you need to respect is going to be that you always need to quote your attribute values. For example, here I have my attribute values. I always need to quote them. So what is true is that HTML will allow you to write your attribute values without quoting them, but it is recommended to quote. Why? Because you are not the only developer. Most developers, like 99% of developers, would necessarily quote their attribute values. And also, quoted attribute values are easier to read, and you must use quotes if your value contains spaces. Okay, let's say, for example, if, yeah, for the title, if I write it, the value of the title contained spaces. If I say this is a paragraph, for example. Here I have spaces. Let's see if I remove the quotes, what will happen? You see, the system will not take into account this sentence here as being the value of my title because I didn't put quotes. So it can be confusing and hard to read if you don't use quotes for your attribute values. So always use quotes, and it's something that you need to keep in your mind as well. So this is good, but this is bad. If you don't put quotes, it's not recommended, it's bad. Another rule. So the next rule that we can talk about is concerning the image here. So when you want to display an image, so the source is like compulsory. It's like compulsory mandatory for you to have the source because the source is going to determine where, the source of the image, the path to the image that you need to display. But what is recommended in HTML is that apart from the source attribute, you always need to specify the alternative text, the width, and the height for your images. Okay, so you always need to specify the alternative text attribute. Like here we say alt. So this is the attribute for the alternative text. This particular attribute is important if the image for some reason cannot be displayed. So if the image cannot be displayed, the alternative text will display instead. So here you can say this is an alternate text. Okay, so you also need to specify maybe the width and the height. Okay, so the width will be for the width of the image, and the height will be the height of the image. But what is recommended is that instead of using the width attribute like this, you have to use, it's recommended to use the CSS property for width. So you need to write style and then inside you can specify the width and height properties. like this. Okay, let me take this, copy the address, paste. So this is how you need to work on your images. Okay, if you remove that like this, it's not okay because as you can see, your image is going to be bigger and it may not be what you want. It may not be how you want it to be displayed on the screen. So you need to put the alternate text like this, and then you need to specify the width and the height, according to the needs in your project. All right, so now another rule that we have to respect is going to be about spaces and equal signs. So HTML allows spaces around equal signs, okay? But spaceless is easier to read and groups entity better together. So what do I mean by that? You see here with my attributes, I'm using the equal sign like this. Okay, here I have my attribute name, the equal sign, and then the value. There's no space between, the attribute name, the equal sign, and the equal sign with the value. So this is better because it's easier to read like this than to have spaces, you know, around my equal sign. Sometimes it can become, difficult to read and group entities. Okay? So what is recommended is that you do not put spaces around the equal sign like this. Yes, so this is better than what I was doing previously. All right. Another thing that we can talk about is that in HTML, it's important to avoid long code lines. So when using an HTML editor, it is not convenient for you to scroll, for example, right and left to read your code. Okay, so you have to try to be to not to be too long. Okay, try to avoid too long lines of code. Okay, so you need to write shorter lines of code so that you won't have to scroll right and left in order to read the entire line of your code. Let's talk about another thing is about blank lines and indentation. So in HTML, you should not add blank lines or spaces or indentation without a reason. So for readability purposes, you have to add your blank lines to separate large or logical code blocks. Okay? For example, here in my code, I can't, for whatever reason, start my image tag here. Okay, like I want to indent that, or like I want to put some space, some blank line in between all my HTML element in the code like this. It's not recommended to do that. But for readability purposes, you can add your blank lines to separate large or logical code blocks. Okay, for example, if you are in a single HTML document, you are creating a table and then you are creating the form, then you can maybe add a blank line to separate to say that here I'm using the table, and down here I'm going to use a form so that we can structure the code intelligently. For readability purposes as well, you can add two spaces of indentation, uh, for readability purposes, but you are not obliged to use the tab key to do that. Okay, you can do it like this, or even sometimes the browser will do it automatically. For example, if you have nested elements, like for example, if I have Like up here, I have a div. So if I want to write another element inside the div here, when I come down here, now you can see there's a little indentation, in the div here. So this is to say that this particular element is contained or is nested in the div like this. And it makes, the reading of your code a lot more easy. Okay, it's a little bit easy to read. All right, so you can add some space for a reason. Okay, like if you have some heading and then some paragraph text here, so you can separate them in order for that to be, uh, uh, easy to read. All right. Let's talk about another element that you need to write, to keep in mind. Another thing that you need to keep in mind is that in HTML, you should never skip the title element. Okay, this is an important element because the title element is required in HTML. So the content of a page title is very important for search engine optimization. So the page title is used by search engine algorithms to decide the order when listing pages in search results. Okay, so because this particular title element will be used, for example, to define a title in your browser toolbar. It's going to be used to provide a title for your page when you add that particular page to favorites. And it's also going to display a title for your page in search engine results. When the your page shows up in a search engine result, it will need to have a title. And that title is, the text that you put here in the title element. So it's really important for optimizing your page for the search engine algorithms. Okay. And one thing that is also recommended is that you always have to make your title, the text that you put here, the title, as accurate and meaningful as possible. So it has to be like a summary of the content of your HTML document. So it has to be accurate and meaningful. So you just don't need to put anything that you want as a title because for no reason. Okay, so a title needs to be a short description, a summary of what your web page is all about. Okay, another mistake that you need to avoid is to forget, okay, is to forget these two elements, the HTML element and then the body element. So these are very important element. Okay, it's true that the HTML will still sometimes validate without the HTML element and the body element, but for the structure of your HTML document, these are very important elements that you need to add. Okay, you need to have them in your HTML document because the body here will be used, to write all the tags and elements that need to display on the web page. That, these elements are going to be visible to the end users. Okay, so as I said, sometimes when you don't write the HTML and the body, your page may still run, okay, may still validate, but it is strongly recommended to always add the HTML and the body tags, okay? If you forget to add the body tag here, sometimes you can have errors in your browsers. Okay. If you don't have the HTML and the body, you know your page may crash and all of that. So in order to avoid that, make sure that you have your structure on point by having an HTML element and a body element. Okay. Another element that you don't need to omit that is also part of the HTML document structure, that is the head element here. Okay. Uh, so if you forget the element but you have the body, for example, what the browser will do is that it's going to add all the elements that you are going to write here. Let's say, for example, if you remove the head like this and you write things like that. What that browser will do is that it's going to move all these elements in the default head. Okay, but normally you are not supposed to forget the head element or omit that. You need to write that because that's part of the structure of your HTML document. So it's recommended to have the head. Okay. In HTML, another rule you need to note is that it is now optional to close empty tags. Like, for example, we all know empty tags. For example, the break line tag, this one. If you say break line like this, okay? It's going to break the line. So it is optional to close that. If you want to close it, you need to add the forward slash like this. This is going to close it. But in HTML, it is not compulsory to close it. It's not a must. So it's optional to close your empty tags. So that's why you will see most developers, when they write these empty tags, they will not necessarily close them, by adding the forward slash. They will simply write it like this. Another empty tag is the meta here. So as you can see, you don't need to close that, but if for whatever reason you want to close that, you can add a forward slash like this. Okay, that's not what I wanted to do. Yeah. Um, all right, so let's talk about another thing. Another element that you have to keep in mind is that you can include the language attribute inside your HTML tag in order, for example, to declare the language of the web page. Okay, this is also important for search engines and browsers. So, for example, here in our HTML, if I want to determine the language of my web page, I can say lang like this, and then say English, US like this. Okay, so this is to say that, okay, the language of my web page is going to be English, but the American English. Yes, so another thing is we're going to talk about metadata. So in order to ensure proper interpretation and correct search engine indexing, so both the language and the character encoding in the meta should be defined as early as possible in HTML document. Okay, so this is to ensure a proper interpretation and correct search engine indexing. So both the language and the character encoding. So the character encoding will be like this. So we say meta name, no, character set, and then you can write UTF-8 like this. So you have to define the language and the meta for meta character encoding in order to ensure the proper interpretation and correct search engine indexing. Like, all of that. Okay, and it's also important to use the viewport. Like this here, I'm having meta, and then I have viewport here. So basically, the viewport is the user's visible area of a web page. It will vary from one device to another. It's going to be smaller on a mobile phone, for example, but it's going to be a lot more bigger on a computer screen. Okay, so here when you add this line of code, meta, name, viewport, content like this, this gives the browser instructions on how to control the page's dimensions and scaling. So this portion of code, width, device width, is going to set the width of the page to follow the screen width of the device, which will vary depending on the device. And the initial scale equal 1.0 is going to set the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded by the browser. And all of that. What else can we talk about? What are the rules that you need to respect? Okay, another rule is about comments. When you write a comment, if your comment is short, make sure that you write it on one line, like this. So let's say my comment is short, so write it in one line. This is an image, so it is a short comment. And then I can close the tag like this. So if your comment is short, write it in one line. But if you have like a long comment or comments that will span more than one line, you should write it like this. Okay, the text you should put it here. Let me rewrite that. You can do something like that. And down here, you can write your text. Maybe this is a long comment example. This is a very long comment. If you want to add a second line, you can write it down here. And if it is the end of your comment, you can add like this. Okay, so that comments that span over more than one line should be written like this, as we have seen here. So this is another rule that you can respect about comments. So long comments are easier to observe if they are indented with spaces and all that, as I've just done that. All right. Another thing, also another rule is that when linking your style sheet, your CSS file, the type attribute here is not compulsory. Okay, you can write it like this, simply like this. Okay, because it's recommended to use simple syntax for linking your style sheet. It's the same thing with JavaScript. Okay. All right. And your CSS rules can also be written compressed, and and long CSS rules can be written on over multiple lines. But this one you already know that about your CSS. And I was saying that even for linking your script, like if you want to link your JavaScript file, you can say script. It's not necessary for you to use the type in order to specify that this is the script. You can directly go to the src attribute and then specify your JavaScript like this. Okay, because in HTML, it's important to use simple syntax for linking your HTML, your CSS file and your external JavaScript file as well. So you do not need the type attribute. It's not compulsory. It's not necessary to add it in this line of code here. Okay. It's also important to use lowercase file name. Okay. For example, here, if I was using um, a relative path, I could say like this, photo that jpg like this. Okay, so you have to use lowercase. You do not need to use uppercase elements like this. All right. Okay. Uh, that's it. What else can we talk about? Let me remove this. So you have to use lowercase file names because some web browsers can be case sensitive about file names. So you need to make sure that the file name is correct. It corresponds you know, to the name given at the source in order to avoid having errors. Sometimes some names in your web browser can be case sensitive. Okay. And when you are saving your file, your HTML file should be saved using the .html extension or the .htm, which is also allowed. So there's no difference between that HTML extension and that HTM because both will be treated as HTML by any browser and any web server. Okay. Um, okay, so these are some of the rules that you need to keep in mind when working with HTML. I know that I have talked about so many of these rules, and there may exist other rules in HTML. If you have them, you know any other rule that I have not talked about in this video, you can feel free to add that in the comment section, for all of us to know about them. As for this video, we are going to stop here. I hope it was informative enough. And as I said, feel free to write in the comment section if you have other rules that you want other people to benefit. You want the community to benefit from these rules in HTML. Feel free to write in the comment section. And I hope the video was informative. Don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Let's meet in the next video.